Welcome to Current Situation, your weekly political pulse. I'm your host, Joshua Gale, alongside South Carolina State House Representative Jordan Pace. Every week, our goal is to help you navigate the complex world of politics through biblically conservative perspectives. Before we jump into today's conversation, we want to take a moment to thank our sponsor.
Stand for Haiti is a nonprofit empowering Haitians towards self-sufficiency. With over 250 volunteers, the organization has completed 20-plus programs, delivered 800-plus buckets of essential items, sponsors 17 students, and runs a literacy program for 80 students and parents. Stand for Haiti is a resource hub for those wanting to help but unsure where to start. Visit standforhaiti.com.
Today, we're discussing how the South Carolina state budget is developed and the biblical definition of generosity. Jordan, how are you?
I'm doing pretty well. How are you, Josh?
I'm doing well. I want to say congratulations. If you follow us on social media, you've seen that Jordan had a opinion piece that was published, and you could find it on the homepage of Blaze Media, which is Glenn Beck's media group. Jordan, there are millions and millions of subscribers to Blaze Media, and it's really cool to see something you've written there, and you wrote it really, really well. Can you briefly, before we jump in today, tell us about that opinion piece?
Sure. They were very generous by let me post it there. Basic premise of it is that I'm explaining why I'm not voting for Nikki Haley for president in the primary on the 24th. We've talked about it a little bit here. It's just her lack of integrity and when she was governor, whether it was stabbing us in the back on tax hikes or handing out huge taxpayer cash handouts to foreign companies, particularly Chinese companies that never fulfilled their promises, or frankly her disastrous time at the UN. So basically, it just lays out the case of all those things and why I'm voting the way I'm voting. Yeah.
Awesome. It was wonderfully written. And if you go back, I believe it was episode 5, the Palmetto State primaries and the Cyrus anointing, that you can go back and listen to that podcast if you haven't listened to it yet, which does explain more about the primary coming up at the end of this month. So Jordan, today we're jumping in. We're going to discuss finances and how the budget at the state level is developed. That's something that we've promised. That is something that does not make a wonderfully enjoyable podcast, but we're going to try to just give this overview. Again, one of our promises of this podcast is to educate folks on what is happening on a state level when it comes to government. So please give us that overview. For viewers like myself, keep it on that 5th grade level for us so that we can completely get a grasp of it. And then we'll jump in and see what the Bible says about generosity.
Yeah. So we're not going to get into the budget itself, like what's being spent on what programs or departments or anything like that. We haven't figured that out yet this year. That'll be happening next week. But really what I want to talk about is like, how does the budget evolve over time? And it takes quite a bit of time for the House budget to get there. Usually the governor's office will put together their proposed budget, which has essentially no weight of law at all. It's really just what they want. And that'll typically be on our desk when we get the first week or so in January. Also that first week, the Ways and Means Committee, which is the committee of the House that writes the budget, will meet in individual subcommittees. Now I'm going to try to keep this on a 5th grade level. There are more than half a dozen of these subcommittees, and each group of 3 or 4 legislators in these subcommittees will take on a task, whether it be higher education spending, like for colleges and universities. There's one for constitutional agencies, so think DHEC, Treasurer's Office, you name it, all those things. Economic development has its own subcommittee. Basically all the things they try to break down into smaller segments. They'll hear testimony. For like the higher ed subcommittee, I sat in on that. I'm not on that committee. I just went to go listen. and learn about what the asks are going to be. But the colleges will come in, give a report. Here's what we spent money on last year. Here's all the things we want money for next year. $50 million here, $10 million there. Same kind of thing happens with the agencies, whether it be Department of Natural Resources or pick an agency, DHEC or DSS. They'll all come and give their report. Here's what we spent money on. Here's what we want next year. Either more spending, the same spending. None of them ask for less money ever. That's never happened, I don't think, ever in the history of the state. How many more employees they want, and the subcommittees will take that testimony and then basically send their report up to the full Ways and Means Committee, which will meet. Actually, I think next week is when they're going to be meeting, multiple days in a row, and they'll take all that information and then craft a giant ream-sized budget out of that. So the timeline takes several weeks to get to the first full meeting of Ways and Means. And here's one of the weird kind of particulars in South Carolina, though. We have a supermajority Republican, we have a Republican supermajority in the House. So not just majority, like 3/4 or 2/3 plus majority in the House. And yet, the Ways and Means Committee, which is arguably the most powerful committee in the House, several of these subcommittees have a majority Democrat membership. So, if it's a 3-member committee, 2 of those 3 will be Democrats, and the chair will be a Democrat, which is very unusual. I find that very odd. But that's the way it is for now. So next week, the full Ways and Means Committee will meet. They'll start producing the budget. There's a lot of graphs involved. I think they'll still hear some testimony, mainly from the individual subcommittees. Will kind of report to each other in this big meeting. And eventually, they'll produce the budget, which will land on our desks. Statutorily, there's a law that says the full budget has to be available to us in printed copy to each member on our desk in the State House so many days before we debate the budget. So that's kind of how the meat is ground, so to speak, how the sausage is made.
Right.
And it's very tedious if it's not something that you're like super interested in.
Right.
Which is why a lot of people kind of pay attention to it. But to give a little bit of example of how much it's grown, last year the budget grew more than 13% compared to the year before. So we're talking about $13 billion in state spending. This is money out of our pockets.
Right.
And this first version of the budget doesn't include what's called earmarks. Now, folks might have heard of earmarks before. Mm-hmm. This is what individual legislators can request things for their districts. So it could be money for the police department, for protective equipment, or it could be hundreds of thousands of dollars for an orangutan exhibit in their local zoo. And yes, that was a real earmark that was passed in the budget last year.
Wow.
I think it was $300,000 for an orangutan exhibit. Crazy stuff. The earmarks come later after the House. The House will vote on the budget over the course of about 2 or 3 days. It is nonstop because we have to vote section by section and press the button every time. So it takes about 2 days usually. We'll send it to the Senate. The Senate will do their same thing, a very similar process, and then they'll send it back with all the earmarks attached that make it through. And we kind of repeat the process based on that. The earmarks are a mess. I mean, this is where the term generosity gets thrown around wrongly, where the individual members were asked for these project funds. And sometimes it's $10,000 for a baseball field, but more often than not, it is hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars, sometimes tens of millions of dollars for something that they just want. Right. Very, very little, if any, accountability. There's not these earmarks don't have the same oversight as the actual budgeted funds. It's like the money that goes to DSS has to come back and give a report on how they spent that money.
Right.
The money in these earmarks, more often than not, we have no idea what they do with the money. There's no follow-up. There's no oversight. And it's used as a way to coerce individual legislators to vote for the budget, even if there's a bunch of just junk in the budget that they don't like. Specifically, I've talked to several freshmen who came in, didn't know how the system worked. Put in some earmarks for lights for their ball field in their hometown, or stuff for the police, sheriff's department, or sheriff's office, or police department in their hometown, and they were legitimately told that by other members, "Hey, if you put this in, that means you have to vote for the budget, and if you don't vote for the budget, you won't get your earmarks." And sure enough, that's what happened. The ones that didn't vote for the budget because of it, there was money for state money that went to abortions, or because hundreds of millions of dollars went to a private corporation to build electric vehicles that shouldn't have, the whole Scout Motors debacle,
Right.
For various reasons, and they didn't get their earmarks. It's the currency of corruption in Colombia, and it really needs to end
Right.
sooner rather than later.
So it ends by exposing it.
Yeah, I mean, it ends by informing people about how this works, and bringing it up to their, because like I said, most people don't pay attention to this budget process. It's arcane, like it's tedious, and frankly, it can be kind of boring. And it makes sense that people should be able to trust their legislators to look out for them. But more often than not, they're not looking out for their constituents. They're looking out for the special interests that are involved in the process.
Right.
So
for the folks that want to help get them reelected.
Mm-hmm.
I can't remember who said it, but if we literally had every week or every month to take a portion of our paycheck
Mm-hmm.
and hand deliver that, in cash or a check, or write a check, we'd pay a lot more attention than we do right now. The fact that it's taken out of our paycheck and we're just supposed to get used to it, and know that that's a part of life. And somehow it just keeps going up, and we're the ones that need to learn how to steward and budget really well what we have. Yet the big portion that's taken to a Columbia is not stewarded well at all.
So that's if we're talking about generosity, though, a lot of times the folks that are pushing, hey, bigger budgets, more spending, we use this term generosity regarding state budget stuff. We want to give generous benefits or generous pay or generous whatever. And I think that's been a misappropriated term regarding government. In Proverbs 22:9, it says, "The generous will themselves be blessed, for they share their food with the poor." And throughout the Bible, every instance we see of generosity in that regard is individuals sharing what they have, whether it's a lot or very little. We have the picture of Abraham across from Sodom and Gomorrah, with some visitors show up to his house. He doesn't know these guys, or to his tent, and he's extremely hospitable to them. Like, he gives them food, gives them water. He even kills the fatted calf, like the best food he had available, he gives to them out of his abundance. And then we also see in the New Testament of when Jesus is preaching before the 5,000, they don't have any food, but this kid shows up with his loaves and fish, with his lunch, and he says, "I don't have much, but here's this." And that's another picture of generosity there. But nowhere in the Bible do we see a picture or an example of government taking from individuals with the threat of violence to give to other people. That's nowhere is that called generous. So that's where I think there's a misappropriation there of this term generosity. And frankly, it doesn't work. I mean, if you go look at the Johnson administration, LBJ back in the 60s and 70s, the war on poverty rates were dropping faster before the war on poverty, like basically before the government got involved, than they have since. So even if it's well intentioned, it doesn't work, because that's not the role of government, according to the Bible, is to enforce contracts, uphold the law, and like Paul says in Romans 13, to punish evildoers and reward good. Reward good by leaving them alone is the implication there. So when government gets out of the scope of doing those things, it fails, because the generosity is supposed to be on individuals and on with the church as an institution. Well, and as far as utility goes too, if we want our dollars to go further, like even to help those who need help, as a broad spectrum, the government assistance for every dollar that they take in taxes that goes to welfare type systems, roughly 33% or 33 cents of every dollar they take winds up in the hands of the welfare recipient, of the person who needs the help.
Right.
So 66 cents of that dollar that they take from you is staying within the government apparatus to facilitate all that. Versus nonprofits, and you know this very well.
Right.
By and large, even with the less efficient nonprofits involved in this mix, like the median for nonprofits is the direct inverse of that. It's like 70 cents of every dollar winds up in the hands of those who need the help. Some really, really solid nonprofits will be like 90 cents of every dollar that have low overhead.
Right.
And you can find actually a list of those really solid nonprofits on the Secretary of State's website who have 10% or less of their spendings on their own overhead.
Yep.
Like that's how you're effective in helping others.
Yeah.
Either do it individually or donate that money, which we do, and particularly in the South and in the United States in general. We're extremely generous on an individual level. But just imagine how much more generous we could be and more effective we could be if the government wasn't taking half of our money every year.
Right. Right. Not to mention, a friend of mine runs a nonprofit called Stand for Haiti, and if you think there's some corruption here, there's a lot of corruption there, but he's learned to navigate, to make sure that he's a great steward of what is given, so that he can help and minister in Haiti. And he's just so wonderful at what he does. And I'm going to put some information about Stand for Haiti in the show notes. And but it's if you want to be generous, look for the folks that are going to steward your generosity really well. So Jordan, yesterday, the Senate passed a $95 billion aid bill for Ukraine and Israel, which is now being sent to the House. Let's unpack that really quickly of what you think will happen next, and then what could actually be done with $95 billion, and where is this money coming from?
Sure. Yeah, so the Senate passed it actually today, early this morning at about 5 o'clock. They stayed up all night to do it. It was a very split vote. Like, it was not an overwhelming majority that passed it. It just kind of squeaked by. And the Speaker of the House, which is where it will be going if it were to become law, has said that he has no intention of taking it up. So it's dead on arrival in the House unless something changes, which is good. They tried to do it a couple weeks ago with some border spending attached to it too. They just tried to tack on a tiny minuscule by comparison amount for the budget, and that it wouldn't go through. So where this money is coming from, everybody is very aware that we've been dealing with higher than normal inflation for the last several years. And that is because the chickens have come home to roost on our debt. So the U.S. Federal debt has now capped, I think, 34 trillion with a T. A few weeks ago, 2 years ago, it was 31 trillion. So we're rapidly speeding that up. The interest that we're paying on the debt is now higher than the spending than what we spend on defense. Like the entire defense budget is now smaller than just the interest on our debt. So where this money is coming from is just we're printing it. The Federal Reserve prints more money. They're not really borrowing it from anyone now because there's no one left to borrow from. They're just, it's called monetizing. They're printing more bills, either physically or digitally, and to cover the bases. And that leads directly to inflation. And just this morning, the inflation rate actually is higher than they expected it to be. I think they were expecting 2.8 and it wound up being 3.2, which basically what that means is inflation is not slowing down, which is what the administration has been claiming for the last few months. It's speeding up because they're spending more money.
Wow.
So that 95 million, I mean, what could they do with it? You list any number of things. What they should do with it is just not print it.
Right.
and stop contributing to the inflation, which is hurting everyone.
Right. But if no one's paying attention, Jordan, and no one's holding people accountable for spending locally, statewide, and nationally, who's stopping anyone? It's going to take the majority to come out of their slumber and to realize that, if, for me and my house, we know that everything that we have comes from the Lord.
That's right.
And we need to be good stewards of that. But when that money leaves my account and goes locally and statewide and nationally, then I need to have a level of accountability there as well. When folks wake up and realize that we're a victim of our own ignorance and lack of accountability, then we're going to step up and be able to, then let's draw back. Let's realize that the folks that are spending this money or accounting for this money have special interest, and let's realize that we're in a steep cycle. This is nothing but a cycle that just gets worse and worse and worse and worse.
Yep.
And we can't leave it up to creative accounting from the U.S. government.
Right.
We can't leave it up to some economists that can forecast, there's too many factors that attribute into what this budget looks like. Years ago when we started forecasting our debt and things like that, we didn't know that we'd be and involved in several wars and things like that around the globe. So it's really, how do we pull back?
So I used to work for former governor and former Congressman Mark Sanford, and this was his constant refrain was, the budget's out of control, our spending's out of control. Eventually it's going to catch up to us. And that's what's happened. When he was in Congress, he proposed something called the penny plan, which essentially cut 1% from all federal spending, every agency across the board. Just 1%, cut it every year for like 3 years. So instead of increasing, you decrease just a little bit. At the time, back when we only had like 25 trillion in debt, it would have stabilized the bleeding, of the debt. It would have stabilized it in like 5 or 6 years. That's all it would have taken.
Wow.
Now Rand Paul in the Senate proposed a 2 penny plan, I think 2 years ago, and it would have done the same thing, but they had to cut 2%. Now I don't know what we can do on the state level. So here's what I was attacked for voting against something called ARPA, the Biden bucks, or what do you want to call it, this infrastructure spending that the feds borrowed a whole bunch of money, printed a whole bunch of money to send to the states to do various projects. I voted against it, and part of the reason I voted against it and said so was the states have to start pushing back on the feds by saying, we don't want this money that's impoverishing us through inflation. Like, the states have to start making those stands. Individually, we need to tell our Congress people, which thankfully South Carolina's congressional delegation, all but one of them, voted against that ARPA money, those Biden bucks, the Green New Deal stuff.
Right.
But that's what we can do on an individual level and on a state level, is stop being beholden, like stop being subservient and indebted to federal spending ourselves, and otherwise we're gonna be forced to be out of off of the dole when the money really runs out, like when they can't print the money to catch up. And when and if the oil producing countries, OPEC is what it's called. Right now, all oil, like 90% of oil trades, are made in dollars. From one country to another, that trade the oil in dollars.
Right.
They're quickly heading away from that. And when and if the day comes where oil is no longer traded in dollars by OPEC, then the dollar becomes a lot less valuable, and we're really, really in trouble. I mean, oil is essentially what's keeping us afloat,
Right.
so to speak.
It was a very interesting interview with Tucker Carlson and Vladimir Putin, and the rest of the world is watching. We like to feel safe and sound over here, but the rest of the world's watching, and they know that our economy is dependent on this oil, and we continue to make decisions that rob us from that.
It's not even that we're dependent on oil. I mean, every country's effectively dependent on fossil fuels. We can produce enough fossil fuels here in the United States for ourselves without an issue.
Which we were.
Under the previous administration, correct?
Right.
It's the actual trading of oil internationally and in the dollars that's propping up our currency. And once an alternative is established, that's what we got to be prepared for.
Right. Absolutely.
Especially in a state level, because just to kind of round this out and as we come to an end, the state appropriations is like 12, 13 billion. Our whole state budget winds up closer to 40, like in the mid 30s, upper to 40, depends how you calculate it. The rest of that money comes from the DC, from the feds, through Social Security, Medicaid, or Medicare, Medicaid block grants, things like that. So we need to be, and that's something, that conversation is not even happening on the state level, is what happens when the feds run out of money to pay for all this stuff that we're doing, whether it's in education or the roads. No one's even talking about that. And we should, because it could run out faster than we realize.
Right. So Jordan, what kind of questions should folks be emailing? I know we said email is secondary to giving a phone call, but what kind of questions can folks be sending to their representatives to make sure that there is a level of accountability as far as spending goes?
So I'd say the number one thing would be email your state rep and state senator and say, we want an end to the earmark system. It's the currency of corruption in Colombia, and we want something that's more accountable and something that doesn't facilitate essentially horse trading, like trading favors and coercing other reps to get their piece of the pie. Whether it's a grant system, we have a couple different proposals that are out there, but that's the main thing, is get rid of this earmark system. And a simple thing is to tell your reps, don't grow the budget more than inflation or more than our population grows. Like, it's pretty easy to set that as the limit of how many more people do we have and what's inflation been for the last year. What do we think it'll be next year? Adjust for that, but don't go above that and grow the size of government. So that would be the two simple messages I would ask folks to tell their state reps and their state senators, particularly in the next few weeks as we go into budget season.
Awesome. Well, Jordan, thank you for enlightening us on what is going on in Colombia when it comes to how the budget is made and this earmark system. And I definitely feel more empowered to know what I can do to hold Colombia accountable. I hope we can come to a place where South Carolina is known for our steadfast stewardship. And so if you guys are listening, join me in that. That is our prayer for our state, and that's what we can do with a level of accountability. So thanks for tuning in to Current Situation, and we look forward to sharing more with you next week.